June 1943. Rabaul Air Base, New Britain. The tropical air hung thick with oil fumes and the distant thud of engines. Japanese ace Lieutenant Saburo, Hawk Sato, leaned against his Zero, cigarette between his fingers, as a mechanic unrolled an American reconnaissance photo. It showed a new U.S. fighter, stocky, wide, its nose heavy and stubby like a bulldog. Sato snorted. "So this is their new fighter? The Hellcat?" His wingman, Ensign Tanaka, burst into laughter. "It looks slower than a transport. If this is the best Grumman can build, the Emperor has nothing to fear." Around them, the men of the Tainan Air Group had every reason to be confident. Their A6M0 was still the symbol of Japan's aerial supremacy. Light, nimble, and deadly in the right hands, it had shredded Allied air wings from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal. The thought of any American aircraft rivaling it felt absurd. But as the Hellcat's first combat squadrons assembled far to the east aboard USS Essex, Yorktown, and Bunker Hill, the laughter in Rabaul would soon fade into silence. The war in the Pacific sky was about to tilt forever. September 1st, 1943. Dawn breaks over the western Pacific, a thin line of gold on endless blue. Aboard the carrier USS Yorktown, CV-10, the flight deck shudders under the roar of radial engines. Young Ensign Alex Tex Harper, age 22, tightens his oxygen mask and glances at the strange beast he's about to fly into battle, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. It was nothing like the sleek Wildcats that came before it. The Hellcat was all muscle. A massive Pratt & Whitney R. 2,800 double Wasp engine, broad wings and armor thick enough to shrug off cannon fire. It wasn't elegant, but it felt solid. Tex would later say, "The moment I throttled up, it was like wrestling a bear that wanted to fly." At 0600 hours, Task Force 15 launched its first strike on Marcus Island, a remote Japanese outpost halfway between Midway and Japan itself. It was the Hellcat's baptism of fire. 46 fighters escorted dauntless dive bombers toward enemy guns, and the rising columns of anti-aircraft bursts. As Tex's squadron broke through the clouds, the first Zeros appeared, dozens of them, diving from the sun like silver knives. Over the radio came the calm voice of Lieutenant Commander William "Killer" Kane. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Hold formation. Let's see what this cat can do." The clash was swift and violent. The Zeros darted in like hornets, but something was different this time. The Hellcats absorbed hits that would have shredded older planes, and their 6.50 caliber Brownings tore back with punishing bursts. One Zero spiraled down in flames, then another. Tex Harper scored his first kill that day, firing a short burst that saw the enemy aircraft peel apart mid-turn. "It didn't feel real," he said later. "You always heard the Zero was untouchable, but this Hellcat just ate them alive." By the end of the mission, not a single Hellcat was lost to enemy fighters. U.S. intelligence later confirmed the Japanese had lost nearly 20 aircraft. What was once mocked as a flying barrel had proven itself a predator. Back at Rabaul, radio intercepts reached the Tainan Air Group that night. Reports claimed a new American fighter had swept the sky clean over Marcus. Saito frowned as he read the message. "Impossible," he muttered. No machine that heavy could outclimb a Zero. But he would soon face it himself and learn how quickly belief can burn away. Aboard USS Essex in the following weeks, the pilots began to understand why the Hellcat worked. Its armor gave them confidence. Its climb rate and roll speed meant they could dictate the fight. "We didn't dogfight," said Lieutenant Harold Bear Childers. "We dove, fired, and climbed out before they could even react. It was like hunting in a steel fortress." The Hellcat's secret lay not in grace, but in power. With 2,000 horsepower at its core and a massive propeller clawing at the air, it could accelerate out of danger faster than any Japanese fighter. Its designers at Grumman, led by Leroy Grumman himself, had learned from every fatal flaw of the Wildcat during the dark days of 1942. The Hellcat's cockpit was higher, visibility sharper, landing gear sturdier for carrier abuse. It was built not for elegance, but for survival and dominance. Meanwhile, Japan's industry was straining. Allied submarines were choking its fuel lines, and its once elite pilot corps had been bled dry in the Solomons. New recruits had only a few dozen flight hours before facing combat. For them, the Zero's agility was no longer enough. Against the Hellcat's speed and firepower, those green pilots were lambs before a storm. October 5th, 1943. The second major test, Wake Island. This time, 94 Hellcats roared off carrier decks in perfect discipline. The battle lasted 2 hours. U.S. Navy records would later count 55 Japanese planes destroyed at the cost of 2 Hellcats. In one engagement, Commander David McCampbell, future Medal of Honor recipient, led his division into a swarm of Zeros. When the dust cleared, he had downed 2 in under 5 minutes. Over the radio, he spoke words that would echo across every ready room in the Pacific. "Gentlemen, this cat's got claws." The nickname stuck. The Wildcat had been defensive. The Hellcat was offensive, a creature built to dominate. And it was just beginning. By late 1943, Allied intelligence confirmed what few dared say aloud. Japan's aerial supremacy was gone. In less than 3 months of combat, the Hellcat's kill ratio had soared past 10 to 1. For every American lost, 10 Japanese aircraft fell. And yet, the Japanese command still dismissed these reports as exaggerated propaganda. Lieutenant Sato and his men were ordered to Truk Lagoon, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, to prepare for what Tokyo believed would be another American probing raid. None of them knew they would soon face the largest carrier onslaught in human history, Operation Hailstone. As the sun sank over the Coral Atoll, the air was thick with confidence. Pilots checked their Zeros, smiled, and lit their cigarettes. Somewhere in the dark, Sato looked up at the stars and murmured, "Tomorrow, we show the Americans what real flyers can do." He could not have known that, within 24 hours, the skies over Truk would belong entirely to the Hellcat, and that his own laughter from months before would echo like a ghost through smoke and fire. February 17th, 1944, 044, 5 hours. The first tremors of Operation Hailstone rippled through the waters around Truk Lagoon. Aboard USS Enterprise, Intrepid, Essex, and a dozen other carriers, the crews of Task Force 58 readied for what Admiral Raymond Spruance had promised would be a Pacific Pearl Harbor, a massive, coordinated strike to cripple Japan's greatest fortress base outside the home islands. Ensign Tex Harper stood once again on the flight deck, helmet strapped, nerves tight. But this time was different. The men knew their machines. They'd flown the Hellcat through storms, through fire, through clouds of flak and swarms of Zeros. It no longer felt like a question of survival. It felt like a mission of retribution. At 0700, the first wave launched. Hellcats, over 140 of them, swept ahead to establish total air superiority. Behind them came the Avengers and Dauntlesses, bomb bays packed with torpedoes and 1,000-pounders. The plan was simple: wipe Truk's airfields, fuel depots, and anchored fleet from the map. As the F6Fs neared the atoll, radar picked up movement enemy aircraft rising to meet them. Over 50 Zeros, launched in desperation from Dublin and Eton airfields, clawed into the sky. Among them was Lieutenant Saburo Saito, now leader of a makeshift defense squadron. His voice crackled over the Japanese radios. "Remember your training. Strike hard, vanish fast. For the Emperor." The two formations met at 15,000 feet. What followed wasn't a dogfight. It was a dismantling. Saito's flight dove toward a squadron of Hellcats cruising in loose formation. His first burst ripped past one of the American fighters, missing wide. But before he could correct, tracers ripped through the sky in response. 2 of his wingmen exploded into fireballs. He yanked the stick left, but the Hellcat was already there. Tex Harper caught the Zero just before it slipped behind a cloud. He throttled forward, fired a 2-second burst, and watched the enemy plane cartwheel toward the ocean. His radio chirped, "Splash 1. Keep your heads, boys. They're breaking." Across the battlefield, Japanese aircraft spiraled down like autumn leaves. Their maneuvers, once so lethal against slower Wildcats, failed against the Hellcat's raw power. The Americans used high-side attacks, diving in with overwhelming speed, then climbing out before the Zeros could react. By 0830, the air above Truk was American. From the deck of USS Intrepid, gunners watched the sky turn strangely quiet. Then the second wave launched. Without enemy fighters, bombers pounded the anchorage with impunity. Japanese cruisers Agano and Naka were split in two. Fuel tanks lit up the horizon in towering columns of black fire. In the air, Saito was running out of fuel and illusions. He spotted the listing wreck of the destroyer Shirayuki below, just as another Zero screamed past him, riddled with bullet holes and trailing smoke. His voice, calm for months, cracked into the headset. "We're not stopping them. It's not possible." His wingman said nothing. He was already dead. By nightfall, over 250 Japanese aircraft were gone, most of them destroyed on the ground. More than 40 ships had been sunk or crippled. The Americans had lost only 25 planes. Among Hellcat squadrons, kill claims soared past 200 inches a single day. In war rooms across Tokyo, silence reigned. One admiral whispered, "Truk is no longer a shield. It is a grave." What few Japanese pilots survived that day bore the memory like a scar. They'd once mocked the Hellcat. They called it fat, slow, ugly. But now, they had no answer for it. It climbed faster, dove harder, hit like a hammer, and shrugged off what the Zero could throw. It was not graceful. It was unstoppable. And the worst was yet to come. On March 19th, Tex Harper stood beside his Hellcat on the deck of USS Bunker Hill, writing the name Hachiman on the fuselage, the god of war. He looked up at the sky. The war was shifting. The Hellcat wasn't a weapon anymore. It was the edge of a sword cutting through the empire. Behind him, thousands of young men trained in simulators, practiced carrier landings, drilled with instructors who had survived the Solomons. America was scaling up not just machines but men. The pilot corps was growing faster than Japan's industry could replace its dead. In the months to come, the Hellcat would sweep through the Marianas, defend the invasion of Saipan, and break the Japanese Navy at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. But the pilots didn't know that yet. All they knew was that this beast, once laughed at, now ruled the skies. And tomorrow, they'd fly it again. June 19th, 1944, the Philippine Sea. At dawn, the horizon was alive with the hum of engines, hundreds of them. Task Force 58, now under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, stretched across the waves like a floating city of steel and fury. The carriers Essex, Yorktown, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Enterprise, and their escorts formed the spearhead of the largest naval air armada in history. On the ready deck of the USS Lexington, Ensign Tex Harper stood beside his Hellcat, now painted with 6 small rising suns beneath the cockpit glass. His mechanic handed him a canteen and nodded toward the ocean. "Word is, the Japanese fleet's coming in full force. Biggest strike they've ever launched." Tex smiled grimly. "Then it's time to see if they've learned how to die better than they fly." At 0830 hours, radar screens aboard USS Bunker Hill and USS Enterprise flickered to life. Multiple incoming raids, hundreds of blips moving in waves heading straight toward the American task force from the west. Japanese Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had unleashed nearly 400 carrier-based aircraft in a desperate bid to repel the U.S. invasion of the Marianas. The Hellcats were scrambled instantly. Within minutes, 220 of them rose from the decks, engines screaming, sunlight flashing across their wings as they climbed to intercept. In his cockpit, Tex heard the terse radio order from Fighter Director Control. "All fighters, Vector 350, altitude 20,000, enemy inbound in mass. Make your kills count, boys." The first radar contact came at 10:35 a.m. The Japanese strike group dive bombers, escorted by Zeros, appeared as tiny specks over the horizon. The Hellcats dove like thunderbolts. Tracers filled the air. Explosions blossomed in the blue. Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu of USS Lexington took down 6 enemy planes in 8 minutes. Commander David McCampbell added 5 more by noon. Harper's squadron engaged a formation of Judies at 16,000 feet, tearing through them in seconds. Over the radio, someone shouted, half in disbelief, "They're falling like flies, like turkeys." That phrase would stick. By the end of the day, 373 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. American losses, 29. The press would later call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But for the pilots who lived it, it wasn't a celebration. It was slaughter. Tex Harper described it years later. "They came at us in beautiful formation, disciplined, brave, but hopeless. You could see it. Their dives were steady, but their tracers missed by miles. They were flying antiques, and half of them didn't even have radios. The Japanese pilots were barely trained, many with less than 100 total flight hours. They fought with courage, but their machines were outclassed and their tactics outdated. Meanwhile, the Hellcat squadrons fought with radar coordination, altitude advantage, and a machine that could take brutal punishment. In one engagement near the USS Cowpens, Harper saw a Hellcat ahead of him take direct cannon hits. Holes ripped through the fuselage, oil pouring from the engine. But the pilot kept flying, rolled inverted, and shot down 2 Zeros before limping back to the carrier. That was the difference. One side was fighting with courage, the other with both courage and industry. By afternoon, the ocean was littered with burning wrecks. The sky reeked of fuel and smoke. Harper banked low, scanning the waves. Lifeboats drifted small, dark shapes. Survivors of the Japanese air arm floated helplessly, their aircraft gone, their fleet leader Ozawa stunned by the magnitude of the defeat. That evening aboard USS Lexington, the ready room was quiet. No one cheered. Tex sat in silence, staring at his hands. "They weren't bad pilots," he said softly. "They just had nothing left to fight with." In Tokyo, reports arrived at Naval General Headquarters the next morning. The Imperial Navy had lost nearly all its carrier air groups. Out of 430 aircraft launched, fewer than 100 returned. Japan's naval air power was effectively annihilated in a single day. Rear Admiral Ugaki, Ozawa's chief of staff, wrote in his diary, "We can no longer carry the war in the air. The pilots were brave, but the gods have turned away." The Hellcat had done its job too well. It wasn't just a plane, it was a symbol of the industrial giant America had become. Grumman's factories on Long Island were turning out one Hellcat every 66 minutes. Shipyards in California launched carriers faster than Japan could sink them. Each pilot, like Tex Harper, was backed by a continent of steel, oil, and precision manufacturing. When Admiral Nimitz received the battle reports aboard USS Enterprise, he said quietly, "Gentlemen, the Japanese Navy has just lost the war." But for the men on the flight decks, the war was far from over. The Hellcat still had islands to conquer, fleets to destroy, and skies to command. Ahead lay the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the rising wind of a new kind of warfare that no pilot could imagine yet. That night, Tex lay in his bunk, listening to the engines rumble below. The Hellcat had turned the tide, but victory felt heavy. Every explosion he'd seen, every black spiral in the sky, stayed in his head. He'd thought vengeance would feel cleaner. It didn't. Outside, the Pacific stretched silent and endless. The laughter of 1,943 was gone. The mockery had burned away, and in its place only the low, steady growl of engines and the memory of smoke drifting over blue water. October 24th, 1944, the Sibuyan Sea. The sky was bruised with smoke, churning from the decks of shattered cruisers and burning destroyers. Beneath it all, America's Third Fleet bore down on the central Philippines. It was the opening phase of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in world history, and the Hellcat would once again lead the charge. Aboard USS Franklin, Ensign Tex Harper finished zipping his flight suit as claxons blared across the ship. Above deck, flight crews scrambled to ready the next strike. Word had come in. A massive Japanese center force, including the super battleship Musashi, was heading straight for the landing beaches. Tex moved quickly, climbing into the cockpit of his Hellcat. He gave a thumbs up to the deck chief, then turned his gaze to the east. In the distance, puffs of anti-aircraft fire peppered the clouds. American dive bombers had already hit the Musashi, but reports said the behemoth still steamed forward. "Your job is air cover. came the orders over radio. Stay high. Intercept anything trying to break through. If they're flying, they die. Tex rolled forward. The arrestor cables snapped free, and the deck fell away beneath him. He climbed into the chaos. At 12,000 feet, the sky was alive with motion. Zeros darted through the clouds, flak exploded in sheets, and tracer fire from escorting cruisers stitched the horizon. A pack of Judy dive bombers approached from the north, aiming for USS Princeton. Tex called it out. Bandits 10 o'clock low. 6 of them. He nosed over and dove, pulling 6 Gs as his Hellcat plummeted through the air. He lined up on the lead Judy, squeezed the trigger, and the twin. 50 seconds and each wing roared to life. The Japanese bomber disintegrated mid-air, wings folding back, engine on fire. Harper's canopy lit up from the explosion, then went dark as he pulled up hard to avoid debris. His squadron fell upon the formation, ripping it apart in seconds. One bomber made it through only to be torn apart by WWII fire before reaching the carrier. On the surface below, the Musashi was absorbing everything America could throw. Dozens of bombs and torpedoes had torn into her armored hull, but she refused to die. It took over 20 Hellcat and Avenger sorties to finally cripple her engines. Tex watched from above as the Leviathan began to list, smoke pouring from 100 wounds. "She's sinking," someone said flatly. "The monster's going down." That night, Tex sat alone by the edge of the hangar bay. The sky was clear now, eerily so. He looked up at the stars and thought of the Japanese pilots he'd seen that day. Some had been damn good, but their skills no longer mattered. The Hellcat outflew them, outgunned them, and most of all outlasted them. Across the fleet, pilots gathered in wardrooms, sharing stories of the day. One Hellcat squadron from USS Enterprise had engaged 15 Zeros and downed 11 without a single loss. Another had escorted torpedo bombers through 5 layers of flak, losing only 1 plane. But the most sobering moment came the next day. October 25th, the battle off Samar. Admiral Kurita's surviving center force had somehow slipped through the San Bernardino Strait during the night and now bore down on a small American escort group, Taffy 3, made up of escort carriers, destroyers, and lightly armed support ships. With the main fleet too far away, the only thing standing between Kurita's battleships and the unarmed landing beaches of Leyte were a few destroyers and their air cover, Hellcats. Tex Harper's squadron was among those scrambled. They flew low, out of ammo, out of bombs, but not out of fight. They dove repeatedly on the Japanese ships, making fake attack runs to draw fire, buying time for Taffy 3 to rally. Tex remembered passing so low over Yamato that he could see sailors on deck firing rifles at him. "It was madness," he said. "We weren't supposed to win that one, but we flew anyway." Their bravery wasn't in kills that day. It was in presence, in buying seconds, in forcing the Japanese to react to ghosts. By noon, Kurita had turned back. The Hellcat had won again, not just with firepower, but with pressure. Constant, merciless pressure. In Tokyo, Admiral Toyota received news of the failure at Leyte. The American fleet had not been driven off. The landings were secure. The Philippines were as good as lost. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover. Tex Harper returned to the Franklin late that evening. His aircraft was pocked with flak holes. His arms ached. His voice was hoarse, but he was alive. So many weren't. He walked the hangar deck slowly, past Hellcats covered with tarp, past the faces of men who had run out of luck. He thought of Saito wherever he was. Maybe he'd been in that sky too. Maybe he'd gone down in silence. Tex paused and looked at his own Hellcat, marked now with 9 kills. It didn't look like much. Still blocky, still ugly, but it had saved lives that day. Bought hours, held the line. It had done what it always did. It flew. It fought. It won. February 16th, 1945. Tokyo Bay lay beneath a thick gray sky, churning with winter winds and smoke. From high above, over 20,000 feet, a new generation of American carriers loomed off the Japanese coast, launching the first coordinated raids on the Japanese home islands since the Doolittle raid in 1942. But this time, it wasn't a symbolic strike. This was a reckoning. Aboard USS Hancock, Lieutenant Tex Harper sat in his cockpit, thumbing the worn photo of his younger brother, a Marine now somewhere near Peleliu. The deck vibrated beneath him as Hellcats, Avengers, and Corsairs prepared for launch. Operation Jamboree, the code name for the air raids, was meant to destroy Japan's last functioning air power ahead of the invasion of Iwo Jima. Tex slid the photo into the pocket of his flight vest and pulled down his goggles. This was no longer about dogfights. It was about crushing what remained. His radio crackled to life. "All squadrons, you are clear to launch. Primary target, Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. Secondary, airfields near Choshi. Scramble, scramble." The Hellcats lifted into the cold, their engines screaming against the wind. The American formation, over 500 strong, moved like a moving wall of thunder. Below them, the industrial heart of the empire waited: docks, shipyards, hangars, and fuel reserves. The last vestiges of a fleet that had once threatened the Pacific. As they crossed into enemy airspace, Tex spotted them specks in the clouds, interceptors rising from hidden fields. Zeros, still flying after all these years, joined now by newer models like the Kawanishi Shiden and Ki 84 Franks. Japan had scraped together everything it had left. Even cadets with barely 10 flight hours had been thrown into cockpits. They came in fast, desperate. Tex broke off with his wingman, Ensign Wilkes, and climbed hard to meet the first wave. A Zero rolled in from above, guns flashing. Tex banked left, let the tracers pass beneath him, then rolled inverted and dropped behind the attacker. His thumb found the trigger. The Browning, 50 seconds, roared, and the Zero split in two. "Splash one," he said flatly, but there was no pride in it. The sky was a chaotic ballet of death. American fighters formed kill circles, baiting Japanese aircraft into turning fights they couldn't win. In one moment, a Shiden scored a hit on a Corsair's wing, only to be blown apart a second later by Tex's squadron leader, Lieutenant Commander McGraw. These were not the skilled tacticians of Rabaul or Truk. They were students, farmers, and teenagers in borrowed flight suits. Tex watched one Ki 43 dive straight into a formation of bombers, not firing, not even turning, just diving headlong in a suicide attack. It missed and spiraled into the sea. "They don't want to win," Wilkes said over the radio. "They just want to die in the air." Tex didn't answer. He was already lining up his next shot. By noon, the Yokosuka arsenal burned. Cranes toppled into the harbor. The cruiser Yahagi, under repair since the Battle of Leyte Gulf, lay capsized. American bombers had done their work, and the Hellcats had kept the skies clean. Back aboard Hancock, the pilots returned, one by one. A few limped in on shot-up wings. Some didn't return at all. Tex counted 5 empty bunks that night. He sat alone on the catwalk above the hangar deck, watching sparks fly as crewmen refueled and rearmed the planes. Below him, his Hellcat sat in silence, dark smudges on the cowling from cannon fire. He remembered Rabaul, the jokes, the arrogance, the laughter from Japanese pilots when the Hellcat first appeared. That laughter was gone now, replaced by silence and smoke and the haunting realization that Japan could no longer defend even its own skies. Days later, when the invasion of Iwo Jima began, the Hellcats were there again, sweeping ahead of the Marines, strafing gun positions, clearing the airfields. Then came Okinawa, where kamikazes came in waves, and the Hellcats flew interception after interception, sometimes 5 sorties a day, clawing enemy planes from the sky, even as American ships burned. Tex's kill count rose to 13. His face grew older, his voice quieter. He stopped painting rising suns on his fuselage. The Hellcat, once seen as a brute, was now legend. It had achieved the impossible, a confirmed kill-to-loss ratio of 19-1. No other fighter in the war came close. It didn't just defeat Japan's finest, it erased their tactical air doctrine, crippled their fleet defenses, and gave the United States complete dominance over every battlefield it touched. In Tokyo, naval officers held quiet meetings in sealed rooms. One admiral said bitterly, "We laughed at their machine, but it was not the machine that defeated us, it was the world behind it. Factories in New York, pilots from Iowa, oil from Texas, steel from Pittsburgh. all packed into a blue, stubby-winged monster that had no business flying as well as it did. But it did. Over and over again. Tex Harper's squadron would be reassigned once more to the waters east of Kyushu. The final phase was beginning. The home islands were within reach, and the sky belonged to the Hellcat. April 6th, 1945, East China Sea. The wind tore across the decks of Task Force 58, now stationed off the coast of Okinawa. Above the horizon, low storm clouds rolled in, promising rain. But it wasn't weather the men feared, it was something far worse. For days, intelligence intercepts and reconnaissance flights had warned of a massive, coordinated attack. Not a conventional one. Something new. Something desperate. They called it Kikusui Floating Chrysanthemum, a series of waves made up not just of bombers and fighters but kamikazes, hundreds of them, pilots trained to die. Tex Harper stood beside his Hellcat on the deck of USS Bunker Hill, wiping condensation from the canopy. His eyes were red. He hadn't slept in over 24 hours. He didn't need to. The adrenaline never left now. Flight control came alive at 0630. Air alert. All Hellcats scramble. Kamikaze formation approaching from bearing 170. Multiple contacts. You are cleared for full intercept. Tex vaulted into his cockpit and strapped in. Within seconds, his F6F Hellcat roared down the deck and launched into the low, humid sky. Rain streaked his windscreen. Beneath him, the fleet bristled with anti-aircraft guns, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all waiting for the horizon to erupt. The Japanese were coming en masse. Nearly 400 aircraft, including over 200 kamikazes, hurtled toward the Allied invasion fleet off Okinawa. Their targets were not fighters or airfields. They were carriers, hospital ships, troop transports. Anything they could destroy before impact. Tex climbed to 15,000 feet and spotted them immediately. Dots emerging from the southeast, low and fast. Betty bombers with rocket pods. Zeros stripped of armor and armed with 250 kilograms bombs beneath their bellies. Some flew in tight formation, others erratic like they were already ghosts. His squadron peeled off. There was no need for tactics anymore, just speed and steel. The first kamikaze came straight at USS Hancock, diving low over the waves. Tex dove in pursuit, opening fire from 800 yards. Tracers lit up the sky, and the Zero exploded before it could descend. A second one slipped through the screen, only to be vaporized by a wall of 5-inch shells from a nearby destroyer. It was chaos. No more clean kill ratios or elegant maneuvering. This was slaughter in reverse. The enemy didn't care if they died. Their goal was to die. The only defense was to kill them first. Tex's wingman, Wilkes, screamed over the radio. He's diving on the Intrepid, I can't catch him." A moment later, a fireball rose from the carrier's forward deck. Tex saw bodies flung from the impact, smoke billowing into the clouds. Another kamikaze zipped past him, engines screaming like a banshee. He rolled into a turn, caught up behind it, and fired until the plane disintegrated midair. By noon, the sky was raining steel. Fighters were taking off, refueling, rearming, and launching again in cycles of 30 minutes. Harper flew 4 sorties in 10 hours. By the end of the day, he'd downed 5 more kamikazes. But still, some got through. The USS Bush, USS Colhoun, and several LSTs burned to the waterline. Marines clung to lifeboats. Destroyers crisscrossed the battlefield rescuing survivors. In the air, the Hellcats formed a nearly constant circle around the fleet, an airborne wall of defiance. It wasn't enough to win the day cleanly. The kamikaze attacks would continue for weeks. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, more than 1,500 Japanese suicide planes would launch against the Allied fleet. The Hellcats were credited with destroying nearly 1,000 of them, often just seconds before impact. One pilot described it as shooting at time bombs with wings. Tex rode home that night, hands trembling as he put pencil to paper. They don't try to fight. They come straight, eyes wide, not even blinking. I shot down one this morning and watched the pieces fall into the sea like feathers. He never turned. never flinched. I don't know if that's bravery or madness. Maybe both. The emotional toll was devastating. American pilots who had once viewed enemy flyers as soldiers began to see them as something else, men robbed of choice, reduced to weapons by a collapsing regime. Every kill felt less like victory and more like a necessary horror. But through it all, the Hellcat remained. Reliable, durable, unflinching. In an age of desperation and suicidal fury, it remained the shield between survival and annihilation. On April 11th, Tex's aircraft took a 20mm hit to the wing. He landed with hydraulics failing, smoke trailing behind him. The deck crew counted 37 holes in the fuselage. They patched it, refilled it, pushed it forward again. That was the Hellcat's nature. It wasn't built to dazzle, it was built to endure. By May, Okinawa was nearly secure. The Japanese Navy was gone. The skies were emptying. But the terror of kamikaze raids had burned itself into the souls of every sailor, pilot, and Marine in the Pacific theater. The pilots of the F6F had held the line not just in the air, but in spirit. Tex Harper stood on the deck one night, watching a sunset through scorched clouds. He lit a cigarette and looked at the Hellcat beside him, its paint dulled by salt and fire. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a survivor. And its war wasn't over yet. July 14th, 1945, 19,000 feet above Honshu. The sun broke through the clouds in wide orange bands as Lieutenant Tex Harper adjusted the trim on his Hellcat. Below, the Japanese countryside rolled by in eerie silence. Factories bombed, flat rail lines twisted into knots, entire towns reduced to scorched geometry. This wasn't the Pacific anymore. This was the home islands. Beneath his boots, Japan trembled on the edge of collapse. The mission that morning was simple. Fighter sweep. No bombers, no escorts, just Hellcats running search and destroy over central Honshu, looking for targets of opportunity. The enemy air force was now a ghost, fragmented, fuel-starved, and disorganized. The few aircraft that rose to meet the Americans were either kamikazes or obsolete trainers, rushed into emergency service. Tex flew point, eyes sweeping left to right, alert for flak or shadow. His wingman, a young pilot from Kansas named Ferris, kept tight formation on his starboard. Radio crackled. Bogies, low 9 o'clock. Looks like a pair of Franks climbing out of Matsudo. Tex banked hard, dropping flaps as he descended into a shallow dive. The terrain below rushed up rice paddies, riverbeds, and the blackened ribs of a factory long since gutted by B-29 raids. He spotted them. 2 Nakajima Ki 80. 4 Franks, flying in wide formation, clearly green. They weren't climbing to fight. They were climbing to die. Tex throttled back and hesitated. For a second, the thought crossed his mind. Do they know they're already dead? But habit took over. He locked the lead Frank in his gun sight, thumbed the trigger, and sent a 4-second burst through its fuselage. The plane rolled, caught fire, and dropped. The second broke formation in panic. Ferris took it cleanly. No radio celebration, no cheers, just silence. They climbed back to altitude. Tex had lost count of his victories. 17? 18? It didn't matter now. What he remembered were the faces of boys, some barely men who had tried to claw into the sky with fuel-starved engines and rifles tied to their dashboards. On the return to USS Bon-Homme Richard, Tex spotted smoke rising from the Tokyo-Yokohama corridor, likely another B-29 firebombing run. For weeks now, the superfortresses had rained hellaflame. The Hellcats flew above it all, herding the bombers, intercepting stragglers, diving on rail convoys, and silencing what little resistance remained. But the enemy didn't stop. On July 19th, a kamikaze managed to strike the destroyer USS Thatcher, even in open waters. On the 24th, Tex's squadron lost 2 Hellcats during a strafing run on airfields near Nagoya. One pilot was found floating near wreckage. The other was never recovered. Tex took it harder than usual. He'd trained that pilot himself. He spent the night sitting beside his plane, tracing the edge of the canopy with a grease pencil, thinking about everything the Hellcat had survived. Rabaul, Truk, Leyte, Okinawa. now Japan. The same engine, the same stubby wings. But the world had changed around it. The enemy was no longer laughing. The empire was no longer advancing. And this war, which had once seemed endless, now felt like it was folding inward. Still, it wasn't over. August 5th. A final mission interdiction near Hachinohe, industrial rail yards and fuel tanks. Tex led 4 Hellcats in low, under the radar. No flak, no fighters. The targets were undefended. They made 2 passes, destroyed a train, and set a fuel depot ablaze. On the 3rd pass, as Tex pulled out of a dive, a lone 20mm shell from a hidden anti-aircraft nest struck his port wing, punching a hole through the aluminum and spraying his cockpit with shrapnel. His instruments went dead. Smoke filled the canopy. His left aileron fluttered like a broken limb. But the engine kept turning. The R-2000-800 groaned. The Hellcat dipped, but it flew. Tex turned back toward the ocean. He radioed his wingman. "Tell the boys not to wait. I'll bring her in slow." An hour later, he limped back to the task force, trailing oil. The deck crew held their breath as he approached. He landed without flaps, touching down hard, bouncing once before catching the wire. The tailhook snapped tight, and the plane shuddered to a stop. Applause broke out across the deck. Tex climbed out, face streaked with smoke, and looked at his bird bullet-riddled, scarred but alive. It was the last time he flew her. 2 days later, on August 6th, news spread across the fleet. Hiroshima had been destroyed by a single bomb. 3 days after that, Nagasaki. Then silence. On August 15th, the war ended. There were no more kamikazes, no more scramble orders, no more air alerts. The Hellcats stayed parked in neat rows on the decks, their engines cool, their wings folded like sleeping giants. Tex walked among them, running a hand across the scorched fuselage of the aircraft that had carried him through fire. The ugly brute they all laughed at. The beast that ruled the skies. The fighter that ended a war. September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. The waters were still as glass beneath the gray sky. Battleships loomed like steel cathedrals. On the deck of the USS Missouri, Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender with trembling hands. General Douglas MacArthur stood rigid at the microphone, his words echoing over a world forever changed. A few miles away, aboard the carrier USS Bonhomme Richard, Lieutenant Tex Harper stood in silence beside his Hellcat. The war was over, just like that. No more air alerts, no more screaming engines, no more diving shadows. Tex didn't cheer, he didn't shout. He only stared at the horizon, where the haze of burned cities still rose in the distance like faded ghosts. On the flight deck around him, dozens of Hellcats sat quietly, some pristine, others pocked with bullet holes, faded paint, and burn marks from Okinawa and Leyte. Each one told a story of violence, endurance, and sacrifice. The war had turned these aircraft from an object of ridicule into a machine of myth. No longer mocked, the F6F Hellcat was now known and feared by every pilot who had faced it and revered by those it had saved. The statistics were staggering. Over the course of the war, Hellcat pilots destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, more than any other Allied fighter. It achieved a confirmed kill-to-loss ratio of 19-1, a number so lopsided that post-war analysts would triple-check the math for decades. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real story was what it had done. It had stopped the bleeding at Guadalcanal. It had ripped apart the myth of zero invincibility over the Marianas. It had held the line during the kamikaze storm at Okinawa and chased the last Japanese squadrons out of the sky above the home islands. And it had done all this with a design that was never meant to be glamorous. The Hellcat was built for utility, for survival, for reliability. In every way, it was the opposite of what Japan had once believed made a fighter supreme. Grumman had understood something critical, something even the best Japanese engineers had underestimated. Wars weren't won by the most agile fighter. They were won by the most survivable, most maintainable, and most available fighter. While Japan's elite pilots flew delicately balanced Zeros, which could be shattered by a single bullet, American pilots flew a beast that could take hits, return fire, and land back on deck with one gear leg and a burning engine. Tex Harper had done it. Twice. So had hundreds of others. By the time the war ended, Grumman had produced 12,275 Hellcats. They'd flown more than 66,000 combat sorties. For many air groups, the Hellcat was the Pacific War. Yet when peace finally came, the transition was disorienting. Squadrons were disbanded. Carriers returned home. The Hellcats were slowly wheeled below decks, their engines powered down for the last time. Some were crated for potential redeployment. Others were scrapped. A few went into training units or served in foreign navies. Tex received his discharge orders in October. He packed his duffel bag in silence, walking the hangar one last time. The war had stripped everything away from him, his innocence, his brother, lost at Peleliu, and even his sense of identity beyond the cockpit. He paused at the nose of his Hellcat, marked now with 19 kills. The mechanic had written a message in chalk on the cowling. Old fighters never die. They just change hangars. Tex traced the message with one finger, then turned and walked into the morning Sunday. For Japan, the sight of the Hellcat never left. Survivors of the war recalled watching the aircraft circle their cities before every bombing raid, knowing what was to follow. In the post-war trials, captured Japanese pilots testified that they knew the tide had turned the first time they saw the Hellcat in combat. "We laughed at it," one said. "Then it hunted us like wolves." But Tex never spoke of hatred. In interviews decades later, he talked about respect about the Japanese pilots who fought to the end, often with nothing but heart and smoke. He didn't glorify the kills. He remembered the close calls, the men who didn't come back, the engine failures, the flak bursts, the night landings in pitching seas. He spoke of the Hellcat as something alive. "It never gave up on me. No matter what I did to her, no matter how many bullets she took, she brought me home. Again and again. She was ugly. She was heavy. She wasn't supposed to win. But she did." In 1961, a restored F6F Hellcat was placed in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Tex was there for the dedication. He stood beside her with his hands in his pockets, head tilted slightly to the left. "She still looks mean," he said with a grin. But behind the grin was memory. Of the boy from Texas who once climbed into a strange new fighter in 1943. Of the friends who never made it back. Of the enemy pilots who never had a chance. Of the long blue sky stretched out over ocean and blood. The war had ended, but the legend was just beginning. The Hellcat didn't just win battles. It buried an empire. Summer, 1985. Chino, California. The air smelled of oil and sun-warmed concrete at the Plains of Fame Air Museum. Visitors lined the rope perimeter, children on their tiptoes, elderly veterans in folding chairs beneath wide straw hats. And then they heard it low, steady, unmistakable. A deep-throated growl that didn't scream like a jet, didn't whine like a Mustang. It was heavier, hungrier. Over the ridge came the F6F Hellcat, still painted navy blue, her broad wings curved into the signature stow-wing fold. She cut across the California sky like a steel thunderhead. She banked once, wagged her wings, and then leveled out for the flyby. In the crowd, a man in his 60s didn't speak. His hands stayed folded in front of him. His eyes locked on the approaching plane. Lieutenant Tex Harper hadn't worn his flight suit in decades. He no longer climbed into cockpits or yelled over engine noise. But in that moment, watching the Hellcat roar past, wheels tucked, belly gleaming, he felt it again. The pressure of the seat against his spine, the tremble of a .50 cal burst, the steady hand of the machine that had carried him through hell. And as the crowd applauded, he whispered under his breath, "That's what kept us alive." Because it wasn't just a warplane. It was a bridge between the desperate improvisation of 1942 and the industrial juggernaut that overwhelmed the Axis. It was the blade the United States sharpened when it finally understood the scale of the war it had entered. The Grumman F6F Hellcat was never sleek, it was never glamorous, but it was perfect for its time. Designed and built in just 18 months, it entered combat with lessons hard-earned from the early Pacific disasters. Grumman didn't aim for elegance. They aimed for survivability and kill potential. A bubble canopy for visibility, armor that could absorb cannon rounds, folding wings for cramped carrier decks, wide landing gear that forgave even rookie pilots, and 6 .50 caliber machine guns that turned enemy aircraft into scrap in seconds. It could take off from a 300-foot deck in high winds, land back shot to pieces, and be flying again the next day. Pilots didn't just fly the Hellcat, they trusted it. Ask any Navy aviator who flew in the war, and they'll tell you, the Hellcat never let them down. And it won the war in the air. From the moment it debuted over Marcus Island in 1943, the Hellcat dismantled Japan's elite squadrons. At the Marianas, it dominated the legendary Turkey Shoot. At Truk, it swept the skies clean. Over Leyte Gulf, it decimated kamikaze waves. Above Tokyo, it hunted remnants of a once-feared air force down to the last airframe. The numbers were almost mythical. 12,275 produced. Over 66,000 combat sorties. 5,223 aerial kills. 305 carrier-based pilots achieving ace status in Hellcats. Kill-to-loss ratio, 19-1. No other Allied fighter matched it. Not in the Pacific. Not in endurance. Not in reliability. But when the war ended, the Hellcat didn't ask for attention. It wasn't paraded like the Mustang or preserved like the Spitfire. It slipped into the shadows, retired, scrapped, or sold. By the early 1950 seconds, it had all but vanished from frontline service. And yet, its ghost remained. In the design philosophy of every future carrier fighter. In the confidence of every naval aviator who launched from a pitching deck. In the lessons passed down through generations. Don't just build for speed. Build for victory. Tex Harper never flew in Korea. He never transitioned to jets. He opened a crop-dusting business in West Texas and lived quietly, rarely speaking of the war. But once a year, he came to the air show in Chino. He'd stand by the fence, listen to the rumble, and watch as the Hellcat rolled over, silhouetted against the Sunday. Sometimes he'd talk to kids, tell them what it felt like to dive on a zero, to fly in a world where every day could be your last. Once, a teenager asked him, "Were you scared?" Tex nodded slowly. Every time. Then he tapped the wing of the Hellcat and said, "But this old girl, she gave us a fighting chance." That's what the F6F was. Not just a machine of war, but a chance. A second chance for a Navy nearly crippled at Pearl Harbor. A fighting chance for young men flung halfway across the ocean. And a final answer to the arrogance of an empire that had once dismissed it as too heavy, too slow, too clumsy to matter. They were wrong. The Hellcat mattered. In fire and smoke. In metal and memory. In the long, slow sweep of history. She ruled the skies when it mattered most. And to the men she carried home, wings torn, hands shaking, heart still beating, she was never ugly. She was beautiful.